Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me and see the slides? There we go. I was wondering if anyone was going to talk to me. Perfect. So we're getting some hellos. All right. So welcome. I know people are still joining, so they can kind of join in when they get a chance. Otherwise, I'm going to get started essentially because we are at 11 o'clock and we do have some content and we want to make sure that we're done within that hour. So welcome to the first part of this series. Good afternoon here. Yeah, so we're probably on some different time zones. It's good morning for me, so you were good. I'm in Alberta, so it's still morning here. All right. So I do want to go through a few things just before we get into the content because we are doing these national webinars. There's just some stuff that we have to go through. So the presentation you're about to view is the intellectual property of the Department of National Defense. So any reproduction or retransmission of the slides contained in this presentation is strictly forbidden. Some of the topics discussed in this webinar may be of a sensitive nature and not appropriate for children, so we ask for parental discretion. We are going to be talking about substances throughout the series, so it's likely not appropriate for children. However, that's completely up to you for your parental discretion. Okay. Please understand that people's stories are theirs alone to tell, and anything that is shared by participants in this webinar, either on the camera or in the chat, is not to be discussed outside the webinar. That being said, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later on cafconnection.ca. Though active participation is definitely encouraged, it would be lovely if you would participate. You may simply follow along without using the chat or the video microphone functions if you prefer. Right now, I don't have your video or microphones turned on. I simply have just the chat going. That's mainly because we find that, if we have a ton of microphones or cameras or anything, it can be a little bit convoluted in that a lot of people are talking at once. However, if you really want your microphone turned on to ask a question, please just let me know. I'll give you that permission. Okay. All right. So if you are here, I hope that you're here for the right thing, I guess. So this is our first part in the series called Stressed, Bored, and Substance Use. So essentially, we'll be going through an introduction to substance use today. I didn't introduce myself yet. So my name is Lisa Fisher. I am the health promotion specialist here at Four Wing Cold Lake. So as I mentioned, it is still the morning here. I will just say right before I get started, I do have a dog, so I'm going to apologize in advance if he does start barking during this. He's not in the room that I'm in, but he's a pretty big dog, so he's pretty loud. And he hasn't figured out the etiquette of webinars yet. All right, so I'm going to do a couple questions before we get into the content. The first thing, I'm just going to actually do a poll. So essentially, when I make this poll live, you're going to just see it instead of your chat. You'll see the poll. Just answer that poll, and then you'll be able to see whatever I kind of answered, and then we can go from there, and you can flip back to your chat. Okay. So I'm going to go in here, and essentially, I'm just going to ask you. Should be live here. Come on. There we go. I'm just going to ask you what group you're from. So are you a regular reserve force member, a civilian employee, a veteran, or a family member? And this just kind of gives us an idea of what audience that we're looking at right now. Okay, most people have answered. We have one holdout, it seems, but that's okay. All right, so it looks like we have majority as a military member, and then we have civilian members as well. No veterans or family members at this time. However, they could potentially join us later on in the session. Okay, so in the chat box, I would like to ask you where you're from. So let me know the city, the province, just kind of give us an idea of where everyone's joining us from today. Oh, as well as veteran. Okay, perfect. Got Cold Lake. Winnipeg, Ontario, Halifax, Gagetown. Okay, so got some Alberta representation, some Ottawa and Ontario area, and some of the Maritimes as well. So that's fantastic. So welcome to the Maritimes as well. So I'm Nova Scotian, and you'll see that my mug is East Coast Lifestyle. So welcome. Welcome to everybody though. All right. So the next section, I just want to kind of go over what this topics are going to be in this series. So we are doing Addictions Awareness series. So it's going to be every Thursday for 7 weeks on this exact time. So today is the first one, which is the introduction to substance use, but we found a more interesting title, which is the stressed, bored, or substance use. Next week will be Rethink the Drink. So we'll be talking about alcohol. May 7th, we'll be Seeing Through the Weeds, so talking about cannabis. May 14th, gambling. May 21st, video and internet gaming. May 28th, we'll be understanding other drugs, so illicit and prescription drugs. Sorry. And June 4th, we'll be shattering the stigma of problematic use. So really learning how to talk about it and going, against the stigma. You don't have to come to every single session if it's not for you. If there's certain ones that interest you or certain ones that work better in your schedule, then for sure we'll welcome you to whatever sessions that you want to come to. If, of course, you want to come to the entire series, that's fantastic, and we'll have you for the entire journey. Okay. All right, so when we look at this, what is substance use? So what do we mean by that? So essentially it's the use of any psychoactive substance which covers all legal and illegal drugs, including alcohol, opioids, amphetamines, and cannabis. So those are just some ideas of what that includes. A lot of people will think of, alcohol specifically. Now cannabis, of course, is legal, so they'll think about that. But of course it includes those illicit drugs, and it includes legal drugs such as prescription drugs that you might be using inappropriately, so misusing them. We will be talking, of course, in this series about gambling and video gaming. So that's not necessarily a substance, but can still represent problematic use if you're overusing it. Okay. Sorry, I don't talk out loud much, so if my voice goes in and out, I apologize. Okay, so in the chat box, I just want to know why you think people use substances. Social. Bored. Fun. Escape. Stress. Mental health, to fit in. Yeah, so those are some really, really good examples of why people might be using substances. When we go through this list, it has quite a few different reasons as to why somebody might use a substance, but of course it's not all encompassing. So let's look at this list here. So stress, you already mentioned that. Lack of control, so if we feel like we don't have control in our lives, we may be more apt to use a substance. When we're bored, so it's kind of similar to when we're bored and we eat food. When we're bored, we're generally going to use substances potentially if that's something that we go to. A couple other people are saying to mess up their health or to escape their head. Yeah. Poor communication. So if we're not able to communicate well, or if we're receiving poor communication from others, then we may go to substances. If we are experiencing resentment, either in personal relationships or let's say at work, let's say you feel like you deserved a posting or you deserved a promotion and you didn't get it, then you may feel resentment and go to substances. The availability of alcohol and other drugs. So in the the military, there is the availability, of course, depending on which element you are. I feel like some elements are a bit more available than others. And it depends on where you're located. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm from Nova Scotia. So when you look at how liquor specifically is available in Nova Scotia, it's through the NSLC. In Alberta, it's a very different story because they're not government-run facilities, so they are just stores. So in Cold Lake, I think we have about 9 or so liquor stores, and we only have about 15,000 people in a population. So that availability is very, very high, right? Shift work. So shift work is really hard on our health. It's really hard on our circadian rhythm because it's not part of our circadian rhythm. So we're asking our bodies to stay awake when they're saying we should be asleep. So in order to cope with that, stay alert, stay awake, or to go back to sleep when we have come off a night shift, then we may resort to alcohol or other drugs. Drinking culture, of course, the military. Would we say that the military is a drinking culture, like more so than it was before, or are we better than we were before, or are we the same? What do we think? Used to be, not anymore. Yes, yes, but less, less. Yeah, so when we teach our addictions courses, generally we ask this question, and many military members will say, yes, it's still a drinking culture, but it's not as much as it was previously. So we are getting better, which is fantastic. Young ones drink more, okay. To feel better or happy is another reason, or to feel nothing at all. To forget, so we talked about that escapism area. Social pressure, so even as an adult, peer pressure is most definitely still a thing. So, if your buddies are saying, why aren't you drinking more? Let's go out, let's have drinks, or any other type of alcohol use, you may, give into that peer pressure for sure. To enhance performance, so some people use drugs to enhance their physical performance. To be accepted, so if you have that social pressure and you're not doing what everyone's doing, then are you going to be accepted? To sleep better, so I did mention with shift work that some people may be using alcohol to fall asleep. People who are insomniacs, they sometimes will go to alcohol to fall asleep because it'll help them fall asleep because it's a depressant. However, it really affects the quality of sleep overall. Or to be social. So a lot of times in our social situations, we see that alcohol, specifically, I go back to alcohol because I think it's something that's more commonly used, is used in those celebrations. So what are some examples of social situations where we might be using substances? Parties, yep. Birthdays, holidays. Yeah. So anything that really is a celebration, promotion, or posting, Remembrance Day for sure. There's also alcohol being consumed on Remembrance Day, weddings. So things that are, a lot of people come together, it's more apt that substances are going to be used in that situation. And when they're not, people seem to be kind of confused as to why they're not available. So I do want to touch base on COVID-19 and substance use. So COVID-19 obviously is something that's probably on the forefront of all of our minds. And the CCSA, or the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, just commissioned a NANOS poll to find out if COVID-19 measures are affecting substance use among Canadians. So essentially they surveyed a group of Canadians, and then they weighted that for the total Canadian population. So what they found was with alcohol, 18% of Canadians have reported an increase in their consumption, while 12% have reported a decrease. When we look at those that are increasing, it's specifically those between the ages of 18 to 54. So 18 to 34-year-olds are increased by 21%, and then ages 35 to 54 are increased by 25%. So you see that there's quite a huge increase among that age group as well. When we look at cannabis, 6% have reported an increase, where 4% have reported a decrease. So it's not as great as when you look at alcohol. When you look at the increase of cannabis, it's specifically, again, 18 to 34-year-olds, you have a 14% increase in that age bracket. So that's something to keep in mind because we are being, kept at home. Obviously, I'm, coming to you live from my spare bedroom turned office. So most of us are spending a lot more time in our homes than we previously were doing. So I do have a question for you. What do you think are the main reasons that alcohol and cannabis use has increased during COVID-19, other than the fact that we're staying home? Okay, so stress, anxiety helps cope with stress, boredom, legal, time availability, home 24 hours, not 16 hours. I do want to just quickly go to a question. Cappy, I believe, said, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. So you've asked, you don't understand the full reasoning why alcohol is still readily available during this time. So when you look at it, I believe PEI had tried to close down their liquor stores and then they had reopened them. When you look at it, you have people who are problematic users, so they are dependent on alcohol. If you are requiring them to cut cold turkey, that's actually quite dangerous to them. Alcohol is a dangerous substance to just stop. because it can lead to seizures and potentially coma and death. So when you look at it that way, as much as you may not agree with alcohol stores being open, we have to kind of try to mitigate harm at this time, because we don't want to be overloading the healthcare, even more so at this time. So that would be one of the reasons why they're still open. So the reasons that people had mentioned is stress, anxiety, boredom. You're home more, so therefore you can have more time to use substances or to drink. And of course, because it's available, less time spent doing other things to keep your mind occupied. So yeah, you guys are on the right track. So essentially they found that the three main reasons why alcohol and cannabis use have increased are change of schedule, because our schedules have completely changed, boredom, and stress. So when you look at change of schedule, some of us may be working the same type of schedule just from home. Other ones are kind of just sitting at home waiting for that moment when we're getting called in. So I'll say for the first week that I was home, I really struggled, because even though I was going, okay, I'm going to be working my 8 to 4, I still was like, do I have to wake up at 6:30, because I literally have to walk 10 steps to my computer. So it's been really struggling to try to figure out, I need to keep a regular schedule as I was doing before, because that's going to help my mental and my physical health overall. For those who are not working from home right now and they're just kind of playing the waiting game, that can be even harder, but still kind of trying to keep a schedule, waking up at the same time, going to bed at the same time, and then of course finding things that are planned to do during that day will really help with that. Boredom, of course, if you're used to working a huge section of your day and now that's taken away, what are you going to do instead? So we need to find some stuff that's going to fill that in rather than using alcohol or cannabis or other substances. And stress. This is a very stressful time. It's incredibly normal and okay to feel distressed with this. It's just really important to learn how to cope with it. Much of this is out of our control. And what happens is when we're really stressed about the things that we can't control, that just increases our stress, right? And then we're not sleeping well, and then we're not eating well, and then we're not, being physically active, and all those things just constantly are going in a cycle and compounding. So learning how to manage that stress is going to be very key. Okay. So the mental health continuum model, I do want to bring that up. Has everybody seen this before? Got a lot of yeses. Perfect. Great. All right. So when we look at the mental health continuum model, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I do want to just give you an idea again about how the model goes. So essentially it is a continuum. So you start with that healthy, which is in the green. There you could move to reacting, which is in the yellow. Injured is in the orange, and ill, of course, is in the red. It is a continuum, so you can move back and forth. You're not just stuck in one section. So, if you end up reacting to something, you're not stuck in yellow. You can move back to the green. Even when you go down to the injured or the ill, you can move back to the green. It's just going to take a bit more time. It could be a bit more difficult to do so. We do need to be aware of these signs, even though these are the general mental health continuum signs. We need to be aware of these that might trigger that need to employ additional strategies so that we can ensure that we stay in the green or we go back to the green. So at this time, it's quite obvious that we're probably going to be reacting sometimes, right? My first week at home, it was a struggle for me. I was really kind of in that reacting zone because I wasn't quite sure what was going on. I had some other personal things I was dealing with. So I needed to realize, hey, my symptoms, I guess, of mental health are now in that reacting area. So what can I do to put myself back in the green? So knowing that irritable, impatience, that's a reacting sign, right? If we're having trouble sleeping, but we're normally a really good sleeper, we need to be concerned about that, okay? So those types of things we need to be aware of so that we can just cope with that, work with that to move back to that healthy functioning, okay? When we look at this with the applied addictions issues, so we're looking at the mental health continuum model applied with addiction. So when you look at the healthy, you have either none, occasional or social alcohol, cannabis use, or gambling and or gaming. So that's where most of us would like to be, okay? So I mean, of course, social may not be happening so much right now, unless, of course, if you look at the gaming option, you might be doing some social gaming online with some people. But alcohol or cannabis use likely not so social right now, but occasional or none at all, okay? When we're reacting, so we're starting to kind of use substances or gaming or gambling in maybe potentially misuse, is when we're looking at regular but controlled use. So our use has increased, but we can still actually control it. When we're looking at the orange zone, so the injured zone, our use has increased even more so, and now we're having a hard time controlling that. There's going to be some negative consequences. When we go into that red, so that ill, our use is very frequent. Okay, we have that inability to control. We really can't control it at all right now, and there are going to be some severe consequences. So to give you an idea of what that really means and what that really looks like, the healthy would be following, let's say, the low risk drinking guidelines if we're talking about alcohol use. Okay, so we are following that on a occasional, circumstance. Okay, when we look at the reacting, those increased negative consequences are really going to be kind of personal. So we're going to see, more hangovers. You're going to see more physical effects. We're going to be spending more time and money in those areas. So we might be buying more alcohol than normal, or we may be spending more time gaming than we normally do. Especially now with trying to escape kind of our realities, we may be seeing that. This could be looking as daily rituals or weekly binges. So if you have a reason to consume alcohol every single day because you have made up this reason in your head, then that could be concerning. When we look at the injured, that would look as your tolerance is going to be increased. Okay, so you're going to need more. We're going to look at potentially withdrawal symptoms if you're trying to stop that substance or you're trying to come away from gaming or gambling. You're going to potentially see that you may have tried to stop, but you didn't do very well and you started again, or the inability to follow the low risk drinking guidelines. So you're consuming more alcohol, let's say, in a one occasion than you should be. With that ill, any attempt to stop is going to likely be followed with a relapse, and there's going to be inability to control it all. You're going to see those severe consequences in your life areas. So financial, personal, work, academic, all of those areas will likely start being affected. When you are in the red for an addiction issue, you still can come back to the green, but likely it's going to require abstinence. Very, very few people would be able to come back from the red with an addiction issue and not be abstinent from whatever that issue was. It's also important to remember that if you have, an addiction to a certain substance or gambling or gaming, and you have become abstinent and you've come back to the green, is to realize that you have to be careful with other substances and or gambling or gaming, because you may, be a little bit more prone to kind of going back down that continuum and back down toward that red if you're using those substances or those other tools. Okay. All right. So when we look at what a substance use disorder is, oh, sorry, I'm just looking at the chat quickly. Get withdrawal symptoms. Yeah, so somebody mentioned you get withdrawal symptoms if you drink before going to sleep. So essentially, if you consume alcohol too close to going to bed, as I mentioned, is a depressant, so you're likely to fall asleep quicker. However, as your body starts processing the alcohol, it essentially decreases your quality of sleep. It doesn't allow you to go to REM sleep. You're more likely to get disturbed sleep and wake up more frequently because your body has now switched off from saying, hey, let's go to sleep, to hey, let's wake up. So it definitely causes some issues with your sleeping. Yeah, same effect for smokers as well. So nicotine can also have that effect as well, which is when you, if you've been on one of our sleep presentations, we do recommend, of course, not consuming alcohol or nicotine too close to bed, as it can have an effect on your sleep. So when we look at a substance use disorder, not all people who use substances are going to develop a substance use disorder. However, we do need to understand that a substance use disorder is a health condition. So it's not that somebody is weak, that they can't handle their liquor, or what have you. It is an actual health condition that requires medical treatment, or whether that be physical treatment and or psychological treatment, okay? It is diagnosed when a person's substance use leads to health issues or problems at home, school, or work. So if you see somebody that is going into that ill category, they would likely be diagnosed with a substance use disorder. It can be mild, moderate, or severe. So you can kind of see it run the gamut depending on what the substance is and that individual and how it is affecting them. When we look at addiction overall, it does cause a person to not be able to control the impulse to use a substance, even when the consequences are negative or harmful. So that's essentially a severe substance use disorder. So if we've ever seen somebody that has a severe substance use disorder, it can be really difficult to understand that. And I've heard it from other people. When you look at people who have difficulty and you say, why can't they just stop? They're ruining their life, right? It's not as simple as that. And we need to really step back from judging people based on what we see on the surface and try to understand what exactly might have led them to using that substance and what they may be struggling with currently that is continuing that use. Okay. Okay, so when we look at types of dependence, so it's physical and psychological. It can be both, or it can be one, depending on what the substance is, or of course, if you're gambling or gaming. So some drugs do tend to be more physically addictive, while others tend to be more psychologically addictive. Many drugs are both. So when we look at a physical dependence, you would see the user normally needs the drug to function normally. So if they're not having that drug, they're not going to be able to function properly. Negative symptoms of withdrawal when the drug is stopped or decreased. So when they're trying to come off of that drug, they are going to experience withdrawal. When we're looking at psychological, that is dependence of the mind. So that's when the person really has difficulty stopping to use that substance or gamble or game or thinking about it. So it's a very preoccupying thought that just continues. They're really unable to stop thinking about it. Strong cravings may be triggered by internal or external cues. So for example, if somebody is trying to, stop drinking alcohol, if they are in social situations where alcohol is being consumed, that can definitely be a trigger for them. So, like smoking is a lot easier for some people, I think, to understand if they've never had an issue with alcohol or another substance. If they have experienced quitting smoking, or they've known somebody that has, there's a lot of things that trigger that use, right? So think of it at that. If a smoker is going to go near somebody who is smoking and they're trying to quit smoking, that is really hard, right? Because the smell of it, just the environment that they're in, all of those things lead them to want a cigarette, even if in their head they're going, no, I don't want it. I want to quit. So it's similar in that sense to somebody who's trying to quit another substance. Behavior is reinforced by consuming the substance in response to the trigger. So essentially what happens is when somebody who is trying to quit something, they have that craving, they use that substance, they feel better. Okay. So going back to cigarettes, that's why, or any tobacco use, that's why it's so difficult to quit nicotine, because nicotine essentially, it releases dopamine that makes you feel good. Okay. And what happens is when you take the nicotine away, that dopamine isn't released properly. So essentially you don't feel so good. Okay. So you take the cigarette, you feel great. Therefore, why not have another one? And it's the same type of thing when you look at other substances. They feel better when they consume it. So therefore, their brain is going, well, that's what you need. Okay. So that's why it's so difficult to kind of stop using when you've become addicted either or have a severe or a moderate substance use disorder. When we look at tolerance, before I go there, what does that mean? Can somebody tell me what tolerance would mean? How much of a substance to affect you? Yeah. Yeah. Increased dosage requirements to get the same effects. Doesn't affect you as much as the first use, for sure. Yeah. So when we look at tolerance, you need an increased amount of any given drug to achieve intoxication or the desired effect that you're going for. The reduction of a drug's effect with continued use of the same dose does decrease over time, right? So you're not going to get the same effects if you're continuing to use the exact same dose over over a long period of time. So that's why when you look at prescription medications and stuff, you're only supposed to use them for a certain amount of time, because they can be addictive. Because let's say for pain relieving medication, you are using it for a long period of time, it's not as effective as when you first started. So therefore you want to increase your dose. You want to continuously increase that, and that is a misuse, right? So that's where it can be a bit tricky when you come to prescription pain medication specifically. When we look at, let's say, alcohol, what you needed to have that drunk effect when you were young and you started drinking for the first time is probably very different than what you needed a few years later if you continue to drink. As my personal experience, when I was younger, of course, I lived in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia, I would say, has a pretty big drinking culture. And so when I drank in Nova Scotia, my tolerance was higher than what it is in Alberta because I'm older, so I don't drink like I did when I was 19 and a university student. I do follow the low risk drinking guidelines now. I very rarely consume alcohol. If I do, I follow the guidelines. I never have more than what the recommendation is. So if you were to ask me to drink the exact same amount that I used to drink as a 19-year-old, I would not feel good, right? My tolerance is a lot lower than what it was back then. I'm just looking at the chat here quickly. The body takes the dosage for granted. It doesn't create it anymore. Yeah, so essentially, the body's saying, yeah, that's cool. You're giving me exactly what you gave me before. I need more in order for you to get what you want out of this, right? So then, therefore, we do increase our consumption. So when we look at withdrawal, so this is for people who have a substance use disorder or use the substance quite frequently. They are going to experience withdrawal. So when a drug is abruptly removed or the dose is significantly decreased is when withdrawal occurs. So withdrawal symptoms are generally the opposite of the drug's effects. So essentially, if a drug makes you feel really calm, a withdrawal symptom would make you feel really anxious. Okay. If it makes you feel less stressed, the likelihood is you're going to feel more stressed, right? That's one of when we look at people who come through our Butt Out program, a lot of the things they struggle with is that they use nicotine as a stress reliever. And so when they're trying to cut back or quit on nicotine, a lot of the times their slip is because of stress. The unpleasantness of withdrawal may be so severe that the individual may use the drug again to avoid or relieve symptoms. Oftentimes that would be the case. I have seen specifically when I look at people who use tobacco, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to kind of quit for good, right? And that's okay. I'm not judging people that take more than one time for sure. But to understand that when they experience those withdrawal symptoms, it's uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. Right? So the only way they know how potentially to make themselves feel better in that moment is to take that substance again. So when we look at withdrawal, let's just say caffeine. Has anybody in here experienced caffeine withdrawal? Okay, we got a couple of yeses. We've heard no, but I heard it gives you a headache. Okay, so if you've experienced caffeine withdrawal, what are some symptoms that you had? I'm just using this as kind of a thought session to see kind of the things that even just caffeine can do if we're trying to stop it. Headache. Everyone is saying headache. Okay. Headache, yeah. Headache and grumpy, yeah. So caffeine is something that it's the world's, #1 most widely used psychoactive substance, right? oftentimes we take it for granted and we just take in whatever. But the reason I use caffeine as this example is because so many people use it, and I've met a lot of people that have tried to either reduce or quit it. I have tried to quit it before. So I used to be a recruiter for a college, so I traveled a lot, and I was dependent on caffeine. And when I switched to a different position, I said, I don't need coffee anymore. So instead of decreasing, I just said, I don't need coffee, we're done. And I was not a pleasant person to be around. I had headaches, I was cranky, I was shaky, it was not great. So realizing that, hey, there are those withdrawal symptoms, can we kind of push through those, or are they becoming so detrimental to our health that we need to go to that, reduction instead of cutting cold turkey? Okay, because what is going to be, more successful, you cutting cold turkey or you reducing? It really depends on the substance that you're using. Okay, I do want to ask, what do you think is the substance that's one of the most dangerous to stop abruptly? I gave you a hint a little bit earlier. Yeah, it is alcohol. A lot of people don't consider it, and I think one of the reasons we don't consider it as to be so dangerous to stop is because it's so widely used in our society that we just think people should just be able to stop it. Kind of the same as we think about cigarettes, right? Cigarettes, alcohol, just stop. And that's not the case. Alcohol can be very dangerous to stop if you've if you have a substance use issue with it. As I mentioned earlier, it can lead, there's a possibility of brain seizures or cardiac arrest if you do stop it abruptly, if you have become very dependent on it. So if you or someone is dependent on alcohol, and you or that person wants to decrease or become abstinent, definitely talk to a healthcare practitioner about that reduction strategy. Gavin's asking if I curbed my consumption of coffee or did you submit to your addiction? So I actually went back to drinking coffee, but I went to one cup a day, and I actually have completely stopped drinking coffee specifically as of December because my dietitian said I couldn't drink it anymore just because of I have some food allergies and stuff. But I'm still allowed to have caffeine in small doses in my tea, which I have right here. So, but thank you. But it's not easy, right? Okay. Before I go into the next slide, I do want to ask you the question. So what do you think are some risk factors involved for people to potentially be using substances? Money. Okay, Rob, what do you mean by money? Cost to feed the addiction? Okay. Can be damaging to social life. Yep. Do you think that social life could potentially be a risk factor? Your peers? Health risk? Yep. Yeah. Okay, so right now I think we're talking a bit more about those things that can come as a result of using substances, for sure. So yeah, when we use substances, we can see that it could be very damaging to our social life. It can cost us a lot of money. We can, have some relationship issues with our family, our friends, marital issues, for sure. So if we are using substances, if we're misusing substances, essentially, it can definitely lead to a lot of issues in our lives. So those are really, really good points for sure. Now, when we look at why we might be more likely to use a substance, what do we think might lead to that? Okay, so saying most addictions might have an underlying social cause, okay? Either past or present. Okay, so I'm going to show you the next slide, and let's really talk about those different areas. So when you look at the risk factors, there's the three main areas. And of course, they overlap, and there can be some other additional ones that are kind of off to the side. But when we look at genetic, so essentially that's when you see that some studies have found that people may develop an inherent vulnerability to the addictive properties of drugs. So the risk of substance use disorders can be higher in some people who have close relatives that have a substance use disorder. However, many people who have a genetic vulnerability don't become addictive, whereas other people who don't have that genetic vulnerability do. So that's not necessarily the only reason somebody may have a substance use disorder. Environmental. What do I mean by environmental? Give me some examples of what could be happening in our environment that might be a risk factor and increase our use of substances or get us to start using a substance. Work stress. Social stress, peer pressure. Yeah. Financials, cultural pressure, traditions to conform, COVID stress. Yeah. Area where you live. Yeah, so that's a great one too, because as I mentioned, in Nova Scotia, I definitely consumed more alcohol than I do in Alberta. And even though the availability technically is higher because of the outlets here, there are no bars in my town. There was one, and it shut down very quickly. It's just not a thing here. Where when I lived in Nova Scotia, there were, I don't even know how many bars. Like, it's crazy how many bars there were. Accessibility. So so we've talked about work stress as well. So, lots of deadlines, doing more with less. I've heard that a lot. So that can definitely be something that could be very stressful. Working with people that you might not jive so well with can be stressful. Cultural pressure and traditions to conform, for sure. There can be definitely certain situations where culture requires you to use certain substance, or they're saying you can't, and therefore, well, I'm going to, right? Accessibility, city versus forest living. Okay, so what would we mean by city versus forest living? I'm interested in that one. The air is different. Yeah, potentially, for sure. Fast-paced, slower lifestyles. Yeah, so the city is a lot more fast-paced, we would say. If you're living more rural, you're probably going to be more of a slower type of lifestyle. So maybe not feeling like you're going to be using substances as much as somebody who lives in the city, or because you live in rural, slower paced, might be bored more often, right? So it really depends on that individual. The home life as well. So if people in your home use substances, what their attitudes or beliefs are about substances, or just even honestly the relationships in the home. If there's a lot of conflict, it may lead to more substance use, or if there's really lack of communication as well. People who do experience prejudice or discrimination or marginalization may use substances to cope with these feelings as well. So if they live in an area where they're constantly experiencing these, so that could be about their culture, their race, their gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, or age, any of those things, if they're really constantly experiencing that, they may be using substances to cope as well. So, and that's going to really depend on that area of where they live, where they work, even their home life, because of the attitudes and behaviors of the people that live in their home. Okay, personal. What are some examples of personal? So what are some things that have to do with us as to could increase our risk of using a substance? Mental health, low self-esteem, feeling inadequate, marginal behavior, death in a family. Unhealthy relationships. Yeah. So there's a lot of different reasons personally why we may be more at risk of using a substance. Somebody did mention mental health. So when we look at the relationship between substance use and mental health, it is a very complex relationship. For those who have a mental health issue, even minimal substance use, so let's say they were using alcohol under the low risk drinking guidelines, it can still really have a huge impact on them. It can worsen the problems with their mental health issue. So it's really important to realize that if you have a mental health issue, if you're choosing to use a substance, you really need to be looking at those risks and those potential and whether you're getting any benefits out of that, and talking to your healthcare practitioner. So for people who are, let's say, depressed and they're using alcohol to cope, alcohol is a depressant, right? So it can definitely exacerbate those issues. When we have difficulty coping and we don't know how to cope, that is a huge risk factor for using substances, because we've talked about using them to feel better, to be happy, to feel nothing at all, for that escapism, because we're stressed. That's because we don't know how to deal with those things, right? We aren't feeling good, and we're not sure how to cope with that. So if we don't have coping techniques, then essentially we may look for something else to make us feel better. So that's a huge, huge risk factor. If we are bored, it's kind of the same. I think of it as the same principle as if you're bored and you eat when you're bored. So that's something I actually I go to, as I don't necessarily emotionally eat, but I bored eat. So when I'm bored, I will go to the kitchen and I go try to find food. And the way I think about it to myself is, when I open the fridge, if I don't see something right away that I want, do I actually want food? Right? So if I'm opening the fridge and I'm like, la, 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 what should I have? Right? I ask myself, are you actually here because you're hungry, or are you bored? So it's the same kind of question that you'd ask for a substance as well. Are you reaching for the beer or the glass of wine or, the joint or whatever because, you want to enjoy it, or because you're bored? Right? If you're using it to help you feel better, that's a really huge red flag. It's also really important to keep in mind that if you're thinking in your head, I can't wait until I can drink because I need it, that need it is, a little red flag for yourself. So for people, we're working from home, many of us, but if, let's say, you're working and you say, oh, I can't wait, this has been such a horrible day, can't wait to have my beer when I get home because, man, do I need it. If I were saying the exact same thing in my head, I'd say, no, you think you need it, but what you need is something else to actually cope with whatever that has happened. So for me, if I were ever in that situation, which I definitely have thought those thoughts before, I don't reach for my wine or my cider or whatever. I go, I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to go for a run, or I'm going to go read, or I'm going to play with my dog. I'm going to do something that doesn't involve alcohol, because I can see that I'm using something to make myself feel better. Right? So we need to really be cognizant of how we're talking to ourselves and the words that we're using. Okay, so somebody's asked about adding eating to the substance abuse section of this model. So we actually have been asked that a few times at our local areas, that, why is eating not really in this? It's not, eating disorders are definitely a concern for sure, but it's not part of the alcohol, other drugs, gambling, and gaming awareness, or AODGA course that we currently put on. So for now, it's not scheduled, but we can always talk to National about whether they have any information that we can put forward on that. Also, another reason that we might be using substances as well is to reduce our inhibitions and to make it easier to talk to people, right? So some of us may not be social. If you're an introvert, you may go, oh crap, I have to go to, a social situation. I'll feel better if I have a drink, right? So that's definitely something that we have to kind of be mindful of, is, are we using it to make ourselves, feel more social? If that's the case, then what can we do to actually increase our comfort in the social situation so that we're not relying on a substance to do that for us? Trina, perfect. Yeah, Dietitians Canada has great resources for that. If you go to unlockfood.ca, so I'll actually type that right in here. That's the information from Dietitians of Canada. That's all the consumer information. So you may be able to find some information on there about emotional eating specifically. For those of you who are in Alberta, they also do an emotional eating series here as well. I'm not sure about other areas. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of that. Okay. Let's go to the next one here quickly. So how drugs interact with your brain. So to just give you kind of a really quick lowdown as to how they interact, and this is most definitely not an in-depth scientific explanation by any means, but essentially when we use a substance, it releases a flood of dopamine in our brains. So dopamine is that chemical that's associated with reward and pleasure. It makes us feel good, okay? So when that is flooded, the brain tries to keep everything in balance. So that's where you're going to see that tolerance, because the brain is becoming desensitized to the substance because it's trying to balance everything out. So when that happens, is essentially more and more of the drug is needed so that your brain is feeling that pleasure sensation, so that you're feeling overall happy and content and like you've rewarded yourself. When that happens, the brain also adapts to decrease the amount of dopamine that is available. So that's one of the reasons why if somebody is used to using a substance and now they're not using a substance, they reportedly feel flat or depressed without the substance, because the brain is decreasing the amount of dopamine that is now available to them. So therefore, if they're feeling flat and depressed, they want the substance again so that they can feel good. So you'll see this should look like a cycle actually, because it's just a continuous cycle that happens, okay? So one thing that I want to give to you before we go into resources and questions here is I have actually included a handout here. So it is the handout from the CCSA, as I mentioned, the Canadian Centre for Substance Use and Addiction, sorry. And it is the COVID-19 alcohol and cannabis use infographic. So essentially, it does explain why people might be using cannabis or alcohol more frequently now, and then of course what that potentially could be doing to their immune system. And of course we need a well-functioning immune system in times like these, because we're all trying to really stay healthy, especially for our military members who are trying to stay healthy so that they can be ready should you need to respond to anything. So keep that in mind if you're somebody who has been increasing your alcohol or cannabis use since you've been at home, or if maybe haven't increased but you still might not be following the lowest drinking guidelines. It does have an effect on your immune system, so maybe try to do some reduction on that, finding some other things to keep yourself busy, to relieve your stress, as well as to plan some things in your schedule so you have a schedule. Have your meals at your normal times, right? That's even just one very simple thing that I think some people have also kind of let go out the window. They eat whenever they want. But having those meal times, having those wake times, having those sleep times, having the times where you exercise, if you do need to work, having that time set out that you're working is all going to really help with, relieving that I don't know what to do with my day, relieving that stress, relieving that boredom. Find a new hobby. Right? This is a really great time to find a new hobby or to learn something new. I learned how to make dog biscuits a couple weeks ago because I've been saying, hey, I should do that sometime. And I just never had the time because I worked, and on my weekends I did other things. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to learn how to bake dog biscuits. And it was a huge stress reliever. And my dog loves the biscuits, so it worked out well. So finding something that's really going to help you. Okay. Cool. Do you have some for cats? I don't have a cat, but you know what? I can take a look. If you want to, I'll actually put in here our Gmail account. If you want to send me an email, let me know if you're looking for something for cats. My Nin actually has 4 cats, so she's definitely a cat lover. So maybe she has something that potentially she could share with you. Well, thank you. All right, so I'm just going to go just to the next slide. These are the resources that we are sorry, just laughing at the question. He gets them in moderation. He does try to stick his head in the fridge because he really wants the dog treats, but he gets them in moderation. So the resources that are available, which we are providing on all of our webinars here: Canada's Forces Member Assistance Program that is available 24/7 to you, Canada Suicide Hotline, the information on COVID-19, Family Information Line, Sexual Misconduct Response Center, Kids Help Phone. You can call or you can text CONNECT to that 686868, or the ARC line in support of COVID-19. If you are looking for more information on, the COVID-19 for substance use, or if you're looking for even more information from the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, I will put the link in right here. That one goes directly to the impacts of COVID-19 on substance use, but you can really go through that whole website if you're interested as well. Last part here is just going to be asking for questions. So if you do have any questions, now is the time. I do want to remind you that there is another session next week on this, but there are so many other sessions that are coming up with National. Every day there are a few sessions going on, so really check those out. The health promotion teams across Canada are really enjoying putting these on for you. So it's been a fantastic learning experience and great to connect with people that we normally aren't able to. All right, just seeing if there are any questions here. Have we identified genetic markers that make different groups more susceptible to certain substances, or is it correlative? To be honest, I'm not entirely sure on that. I haven't done a lot of research specifically in genetic markers for substances. But yet again, if you want me to see if I can find information on that, please just send an email to that forwardinghealthpromotion@gmail.com, and I can ask our national SME to see if there's any information they can provide, and I will forward that along to you. The next session is called Rethink the Drink, so it's going to be about alcohol use specifically. Do I need to re-register for the next session, or will I get an email? So how they've done it is our sessions are all individual. So when you're looking at trying to register, there are different registration links for each of the sessions. If you just hold on 1 second here, I will actually be able to find you that link. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. Found it. There you go. There's we have a package delivered, so the dog is barking. So that is the link for the registration for next week. Awesome. Thank you all for coming. It was great talking with you. And if you do have any questions, he wants a biscuit. He probably does. If you do have any questions after this and you're not quite sure on the answer, feel free to send us an email or to talk to your local health promotion team, and they can definitely look into that for you. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.